Afghanistan from 2003 until 2005. Today, he's a distinguished practitioner in residence at American University School of International Service. Before he retired, Lieutenant General Barno commanded a brigade that included hundreds of women. I visited the general in his Washington, D.C. office recently, and he says that as long as the services maintain their high standards for combat roles, the armed forces will only improve by including women.
They're looking at the psychological screening, they're looking at what they can do physically, they're looking at their mental abilities, blending these all together, maintaining a very tough standard. If they can get in and do that and become part of the team, you're not going to have any issues with cohesion. And those teams form around the people that are there. I commanded a brigade of about 2,000 soldiers. It was 20% women. And I watched units that had just integrated women in, formed the same kind of high-powered teams that I saw in units that were all male. So it's all about building around those teams of individuals coming together to accomplish a task.
What have we learned from other recent cases of integration? The repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell comes immediately to mind. What have we learned through that process or other similar processes that are going to inform how to proceed here?
Well, I think that's exactly right. I can recall a lot of the pushback before the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, and I got involved in some heated email debates about that with some people that are pretty knowledgeable, and there were strong arguments that this was going to disrupt these units. We've seen 0.00 of that across the force in the last 2 years. So I think that's instructive here. Bringing women in is not the same. But again, if we maintain the standard, if we build teams that are working together from the beginning to get the mission accomplished, I'm confident that these are going to be better units at the end of the day.
I want to read, you've probably read this, the RAND Corporation did a study of about 7,000 special operators. Some 85% of the respondents said they oppose opening the special operations jobs to women, and some 70% oppose having women in their individual units. More than 80% said women aren't strong enough. What does it mean to this effort if a vast majority of the men who are already doing these highly secret, highly demanding, very respected jobs in the special operations units just don't want it?
Well, I'd say two things about that. Number one, I think if I went back and I surveyed the fighter pilot community 20 years ago, before we integrated women into fighter squadrons in the Navy and the Air Force, I would have gotten the exact same polling numbers. Women weren't tough enough. This is a man's job. This is physically demanding, that they're not going to be able to meet the standards. We found none of that to be the case. The second observation would be that virtually everybody you're talking to in this study serves in male-only units. They have no experience of serving in a unit that was integrated between men and women that were performing tough battlefield tasks out there. There are a lot of those units out there today, and they're engineer units. So I think they're going to find they're going to be a better unit, they're going to be more effective, and they're going to have a broader insight into some of the really complex gray zone challenges in warfare that these units themselves are facing today and are struggling with right now.
I spent a lot of time covering the Hill, so I've covered a lot of the debates with Senator Gillibrand and others, Senator McCaskill, over sexual assault in the military. You've written in the press that a move like this should actually help with a rampant culture of sexual abuse and sexual assault in the military. A lot of people intuitively have the opposite view, that if you throw people together, it's an environment that might lead to those types of assaults. You say the opposite.
I don't think you can have it both ways. We have, quote unquote, thrown those people together now across 80% of all the jobs in the military, and we've done that for 20 plus years. I don't think the results of that have said that this has now worsened the problem somehow or another. If we have a military that was only men or only women, we'd still have this problem in same-sex challenges. I'm confident, again, from my own experience out there, watching units integrate and leading a force as a colonel that was 20% women, that units that have got women in there that are made part of the team have fewer problems than those that have got women on the outside looking in. So I actually think from a cultural standpoint, this will be beneficial to the military as a whole. If every unit has women, if every unit understands women are part of the team, women aren't some outside entity out there they have no contact, no dealings with, this is going to build stronger teams, and I think that'll help protect against some of these egregious problems.
So what's going on with the Marines? Let's talk about the Marines for 1 second, because they were, and maybe this doesn't surprise people, the Marines were the branch that reacted to this immediately and sort of said to the Secretary of Defense, there are certain jobs where we just don't want this. Now, of course, they were overruled because the Secretary of Defense and the President have been clear. But what's going on at the Marines? What are those jobs that they don't want to include women in, and what does it say about Marine culture, and will they be able to accommodate this decision?
Well, they'll certainly be able to accommodate. Marines are incredibly effective. They've got amazingly capable leaders, and they will charge this hill just like they charge every other successfully. I'm not sure how to actually handicap their thinking on how they looked at this. I find it interesting that the Army has machine gunners, the Army has recon specialists, and the Army has fire support specialists. And the Navy and the SEAL community has people that do those things and more. Yet neither the SEAL community, the Army Special Ops Ranger or Special Forces community, or the Army Infantry community, elected to, decide to ask for an exception to the policy to have women ruled out. So, I mean, part of it's the culture. The other services have a lot more women in them, so their culture's a bit different. But at the end of the day, the Secretary made his decision, and I'm confident the Marines are going to move out on this and take the objective like they do every other one they're given.
Caveats are important. You don't implement a decision like this without good data. What are some of the things to watch out for? I mean, to a lot of people, it's a no-brainer, sure, but when you're planning a unit of warfighters, you don't move too quickly. You don't do anything that undermines combat capability. So if you were the one, sitting at the drafting table, I guess, mapping out how this goes, what do you watch out for?
I think two things. Number one is you want to make sure those standards stay in place, and you want to make sure that they're administered objectively without regard to whether men or women are going through the evaluation. So the Army, I think, did a superb job in how they approached this with Ranger School. I got down there to watch that, and I'm very critical on the Army of a lot of things. I think they did this very, very well. I was impressed with what I saw down there. So secondly, I think the services have to be very thoughtful about how they bring women into these units. Finding one or two women who are qualified and putting them in a battalion of 800 Marine infantrymen is not a great idea. And the services have learned this as they've integrated ships in the Navy and submarines in the Navy. So what they want to do is they needed to collect a number of qualified women who've gotten through the training and then bring them in together with officers, non-commissioned officers, and junior soldiers in a tranche so that there's a critical mass that arrives at the unit at the same time.
Lieutenant General David Barno, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's Lieutenant General David Barno, Senior American Commander of U.S. and Coalition Forces in Afghanistan from 2003 until 2005, now a distinguished practitioner in residence at American University School of International Service.
This is Charlie Herman, business editor at WNYC. It's estimated that over 30% of all charitable giving in the United States occurs in the month of December. If WNYC is on the list of organizations you'll support this month, how about you check us off that list today? Help pay for another year of exceptional radio. Just visit WNYC.org or call 888-376-9692, and thanks.
WNYC support comes from the Montefiore Einstein Center for Heart and Vascular Care. For more than 50 years, the Heart and Vascular Center has been dedicated to leading-edge research in cardiac diagnosis and treatment. More information at montefiore.org.
This is The Takeaway on 93.9 FM and WNYC.org. Coming up at 4, a wrap-up of the day's news on All Things Considered and WNYC. It's The Takeaway. Todd Zwillich filling in for John Hockenberry. Republican candidates continue their crisscrossing of the country this week, and despite their differences, they're flying under one banner.
I've evolved on many issues over the years, and you know who else has is Ronald Reagan evolved on many issues.
That's Donald Trump back in the first GOP debate, comparing his evolution on issues like abortion and his past support of Democrats to Ronald Reagan. Trump has revived Reagan's campaign slogan with his Make America Great Again trucker hats, and like Reagan, he's gained support among white blue-collar voters. But Reagan, just like Trump, was despised by the Republican establishment of his day. A Republican senator told the New York Times in 1975 during Reagan's challenge to President Gerald Ford, quote, "A Reagan nomination and the crushing defeat likely to follow could signal the beginning of the end of our party as an effective force in American life." Sound familiar? Listen to Republican Senator and former presidential candidate Lindsey Graham of South Carolina on CNN back in August.
Donald Trump is not going to be the nominee of the Republican Party. If he is, that's the end of the Republican Party.
Rick Perlstein is a national correspondent for the Washington Spectator and author of Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Nixon and the Rise of Reagan, and he joins me now. Welcome, Rick.
Very pleased to be here.
Well, I just played that clip from Lindsey Graham, who, as we reported yesterday, is no longer in the race, so maybe that tells us all we need to know. But Ronald Reagan heard similar accusations and similar sort of foreboding in the mid-'70s to his own candidacy, didn't he?
Yes, and then before that he heard the similar forebodings in the mid-1960s when he ran for governor. And then he did something very unprecedented. He announced that he was going to run against a incumbent president of his own party, Gerald Ford for the 1976 nomination, and he came very, very close. It's kind of a forgotten story. Gerald Ford pulls it out, and the New Yorker says, well, that's it for Ronald Reagan's political career. And you heard that, almost through the presidential election in 1980. I learned from a speechwriter for Jimmy Carter that they were absolutely convinced that all it would take to finish Ronald Reagan once and for all was to get him on that debate stage with Jimmy Carter. Ronald Reagan was widely seen to have won the debate, and that was a week before the election, and he ended up with a landslide and, of course, served 2 terms. And now he's, we talk about the age of Reagan.
And so now it seems, at least in certain parts, Donald Trump is kind of repeating some of the Reagan playbook, certainly an appeal to blue-collar, white middle-class voters. Has he been reading up on Reagan's political strategy here? Do you think it's a carbon copy in that way?
He's certainly very specifically referred to a phrase of Richard Nixon's, which is that he's the candidate of the silent majority. In other words, that kind of gut-level, middle American sense that, we are the backbone of the country, and you might not hear about us because, the liberals are controlling the media, but wait until we get our voice and we're going to be roaring. And of course, Ronald Reagan picked up on that same theme, and his appeal to blue-collar white voters had a lot to do with the sense that their world was being usurped by minorities, by people on welfare, by protesters, and all the rest. And of course, it proved extraordinarily successful.
Help us remember the state of the Republican Party in 1976 when Ronald Reagan first ran and lost, and then set himself up to win in 1980. How did he accomplish a primary, and what was his message then?
Well, it was far worse, according to the pundits, than it is now. There was a poll taken by Ford's pollster showing that only 18% of the country was identifying themselves as Republicans at the time. It was after Watergate. And interestingly enough, the reason given for why the Republican Party was so weak and so vulnerable was that the conservatives were taking it over. What the kind of pundits didn't understand was that the conservatives were motivating voters and issues that had not been part of the political process before. They were adding people to the political process through issues like abortion, opposition to gay rights, through gun control, and things like that.
People have tied the Reagan strategy to the success that Donald Trump is having, but I'm hearing a lot more similarities with the argument Ted Cruz is making for the nomination. Ted Cruz is asked, you're so conservative, how can you win? You can never win being so far right. His answer is, millions and millions of real conservatives stayed home because they're disaffected. I can win on a wave of conservative support. It doesn't have to be moderates. I don't need the broad middle.
There's a certain kind of almost messianic faith that conservatives have, that they're so right that they can't possibly lose, and that can be a real advantage when it comes to the kind of energy that it takes to win an election, but it can be a real disadvantage when it comes to kind of sober assessments of the electoral situation.
And so with all of the clamor to claim Ronald Reagan's mantle, his legacy, his name, his message, you see it all over the Republican field, and we understand why. He's a respected and celebrated figure of the right and of republicanism. Is there a candidate running now who comes closest to the Reagan vision? And if the answer is yes, this is 2015, not 1980. Should they want to have the Reagan mantle, or do they need something new?
We're beginning to see that actually break up in the Republican Party. Very interestingly, Bill O'Reilly wrote a book called Killing Reagan that has all the Reagan dieharders apoplectic with rage because he suggests that, Reagan was incapacitated in his second term as president. So we're beginning to see that particular fever break. Both Cruz and Walker, who of course is no longer in the race, come very much out of that conservative movement and conservative infrastructure that was built around the Goldwater and Reagan campaign. The Trump campaign is not part of that infrastructure. So even though he, has that kind of charisma that is kind of attracting voters like Reagan did, he certainly does not kind of claim obeisance to the alpha and the omega of the conservative movement's ideological agenda. So Reagan may not be as relevant to this election as the Republicans would hope.
Rick Perlstein is national correspondent for the Washington Spectator. Rick, thanks for talking to us.
My pleasure.
Rick Perlstein is also author of Invisible Bridge, The Fall of Richard Nixon, and The Rise of Reagan. Coming up later this hour, the real investigative journalist who broke the Catholic sex abuse scandal wide open and became the subject of the Golden Globe-nominated film Spotlight.
The psychological impact of this is massive and ongoing. I mean, we've been hearing from many victims in past weeks who are only now coming forward decades later. I had someone email me, a grown man, and say, I still wonder, was it something I did that made this happen? Of course it wasn't. But people still wrestle with that decades later, and that is a trauma that's hard to recover from.
We'll have more with the Boston Globe Spotlight team later in the show. Stay with us.
Support for The Takeaway comes from TIAA-CREF, a global financial company that's created to serve and built to perform. Learn more at TIAA.org. And Lumosity, offering a 10-minute fit test to challenge memory, attention, and problem solving. With brain games to calculate baseline scores and build a personalized brain training program. Performance can be compared to global averages. Learn more at Lumosity.com.
Esa-Pekka Salonen is a superstar conductor, and he's used to the trappings of the job.
You fly first class and you stay in nice
You're a
hotels.
star.
You're a star.
He's also a composer, and in that role, he and his wife once stayed in a hotel that Salonen felt just wasn't up to snuff.
She looks at me and says, shut up. You're here as a composer, so just suck it up.
This is Alec Baldwin, composer and conductor Esa-Pekka Salonen, this week at here'sthething.org.
WNYC receives support from Vital Projects Fund, supporting the Museum of Modern Art, now presenting the critically acclaimed exhibition Picasso Sculpture. More info and time tickets at MoMA.org.
You're listening to The Takeaway on 93.9 FM and WNYC.org. Stay tuned for the latest news on all things considered and WNYC. Welcome back to The Takeaway. Todd Zwillich with you. Before you rack up too much credit card debt this holiday season, here's an inside look at a system designed to favor debt collectors and disable consumers. When debt gets too old or can't be collected, banks sell it, not piece by piece, but in huge volumes, thousands of unpaid bills at a time, often decades old. That debt is often sold to third-party debt collectors who then use the court system to collect those debts. But that court system itself isn't a place where consumers can fight back. It's, in a word, rigged by the law itself. Peter Holland is a consumer rights lawyer in Maryland who's been following the debt collection industry for years, and he joins me now. Peter, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Take a second and walk me through how big volumes of thousands of unpaid bills can be churned and turned into what I'm led to understand as a $100 billion a year industry of debt collection.
What happens primarily with credit card debt, but now it's happening with student loan debt and car loans and things of that nature, is after a certain period of time, a bank, if they have, say, $100 million worth of credit card receivables outstanding, they get to tell the regulators and their investors that, you know, they're looking really good, they're looking healthy, they're owed $100 million. What happens, though, is the IRS says that after 180 days of an account not getting paid, suddenly that account can no longer be considered an asset, an account receivable. Now it switches over to a liability. And so what has developed over the past couple of decades is this whole secondary market called the debt buying market, where banks, as you said, will just package and bundle debts and sell them to investors, debt buyers, who are literally buying an interest in a claim. The problem that has developed is that the banks and the debt buyers have gotten together and said, we're going to sell you not only our good accounts, but we're also going to perhaps be selling some of the not so good accounts. And some of the accounts that we're selling may include accounts that were already discharged in bankruptcy, accounts that have already been settled, accounts that are the result of identity theft, and accounts that we don't have the documentation to prove either that the person actually owes it or that the amount owed is accurate.
So, Peter Holland, a lot of the claims may be legitimate, a lot of them may be erroneous, but then what happens when these debt collectors turn around to collect, let's say, $4,000, $5,000 from a consumer, from Joe Smith or Mary Jones? who they say owes them money. What happens?
Debt buyers literally flood the courts. Typically, for $2, $3, $4,000, what most people would call small claims. And the business model is to file them, and they understand that on a $2,000 lawsuit, most people simply aren't going to respond. And the judges feel, judges have reported they feel no option other than I better just sign off. It's a default judgment system.
Peter Holland, this sounds like the kind of situation that's ripe for a countersuit or a class action lawsuit.
The problem is that class actions in this country and in this context are often defeated by forced arbitration provisions in contracts. What it means is that somewhere in the fine print of, say, a credit card contract you had with your bank, it says you have no right to sue us in court. We can sue you in court, but if you want to come after us, you will get no judge, no jury, no right to appeal.
So what's the best recourse here, Peter Holland, for individuals?
What needs to happen in this country is forced arbitration in consumer contracts needs to be eliminated.
A debt collection system in the United States that seems to tilt the power decidedly in the favor of debt collection companies and not consumers. Peter Holland, consumer rights lawyer from Maryland. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
3 years ago, the process of kicking out more than 300 members of the Nooksack Native American tribe in Northwest Washington state began. The process is known as disenrollment, and for those 3 years, the 306 tribal members, as they're known, have been fighting that process, desperate to avoid what they refer to as tribal identity theft. Gabriel Galanda is a tribal attorney in Seattle and counsel for the 306 clan, and he says this isn't just happening in the state of Washington. More than 70 tribal governments of the 560 across the United States have participated in disenrollment.
The common denominator is greed or power, and perhaps even vendetta. At Nooksack, it seems to be a matter of political vendetta, and that the current powers that be, for a period of many years, they were not in power because the so-called Nooksack 306 were. Now that the current powers that be are in power, they would rather do away with the 306 so they could sustain their power in perpetuity.
In other cases outside of the Nooksack, which is your case, sometimes it seems to be about simply money, right? A lot of tribes, although not all, certainly have casino interests. In some cases, it seems to be a question of cutting other people out of profits or at least out of decision-making when it comes to business interests like that.
Yeah, that's the money denominator, and my research suggests that for the better part of 100 years, when there are tribal communally held assets, what follows by federal design is disenrollment. In the 1900s, cash assets were divided amongst tribal members, and in the early 1900s, that's when people began being removed from the rolls. The same held true in the 1950s, same held true in the 1970s, and now most notably since 1988, with the advent of Indian gaming, now a $30 billion industry, you see absolute cause and effect relative to the cash distribution of gaming assets to members, and ultimately certain members trying to jettison their relatives so they get wider slices of the per capita gaming pie.
Now, there must be some legitimate uses of this process, right? I mean, it seems to make sense, despite the abuses that you're alleging, that a tribe or elders or whoever's in charge would have the ability to excommunicate, for lack of a better word, or jettison members who they felt needed to be expelled.
Well, excommunication to me sounds as if it was banishment. Now, banishment is normative traditionally in terms of indigenous custom. Banishment, however, was reserved for the most drastic cases of a person violating the ways of their community, typically for things like rape or murder or violent crime. That's different than disenrollment. But people who argue for disenrollment will say things like, well, we need to correct our roles. My counterpoint to that, though, is the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. There's not even a word for being de-citizened like there is disenrolled. Now, prospectively, perhaps you want to make sure that mistakes do not repeat, but retrospectively, you should not go back and tell a child who was raised thinking they're tribal, and now perhaps they're a young adult, and tell them that they are no longer tribal.
What does disenrollment mean on a practical level for the person who's disenrolled? I mean, in the eyes of the federal government, are you completely disenrolled from any federal benefits you're entitled to on tribal land?
Yeah, so first, the legal effect is you are presently legally treated as a Native American. Once you are disenrolled, you are then legally treated as a non-Indian or as a standard American citizen. The practical effect of being treated legally as a non-Indian is if you treaty fished, for example, for subsistence to take care of your family, you can no longer do that. If you were provided healthcare benefits through the Indian Health Services by way of the federal government, you're no longer entitled to healthcare benefits. You can no longer take advantage of subsidized housing programs. In fact, you may own your home by virtue of that program. But then the question of exile comes to play. Yet, the Obama administration and the Interior Department and the Bureau of Indian Affairs purposely turns a blind eye and deaf ear to disenrollment because it's ugly. So they simply look away, even though they created the issue and their laws suggest they must play a role. Membership or citizenship, or what's traditionally known as kinship or belonging, has accurately been described as an Indian person's everything. So for the Nooksack 306, quite literally and figuratively, everything is at stake for them.
Gabriel Galenda represents the 306 clan of the Nooksack tribe currently in a dispute over disenrollment from the Nooksack tribe in Washington state. Gabriel Galenda, thank you so much.
Thank you so much for your time.
We reached out to Nooksack Council Leader Bob Kelly for comment. We didn't receive a response.
Support for The Takeaway comes from the Leukemia and Lymphoma Society, which has funded research that led to blood cancer treatments such as chemotherapy and stem cell transplants, and more recently, targeted therapies and immunotherapies to save thousands of lives. More at lls.org.
The Brian Miller Show bookshelf gave us some great guests in 2015. We'll re-air a few on our next show, like Sarah Vowell on Marquis de Lafayette, Elizabeth Gilbert on Living Beyond Fear, and Wendell Pierce on acting as social change.
Art was always an act of self-determination, an act of insurrection, an act of revolt, an act of resilience.
The Brian Miller Show and our favorite author interview special at 10 a.m. on WNYC.
You're listening to The Takeaway from WNYC and PRI Public Radio International in collaboration with the New York Times and WGBH Boston Public Radio.
Holiday season is Oscar movie time, and one of the most critically acclaimed films of the season is Spotlight.
Mitch, are you telling me that the Catholic Church removed legal documents from that courthouse?
Look, I'm not crazy. I'm not paranoid. I'm experienced. Check the docket. You'll see. They control everything.
Now, the film is based on the true story of the Boston Globe's Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting on the pedophile pre-scandal in the Catholic Church. John Hockenberry sat down with two of the reporters who broke that story for the Globe, Michael Rezendes and Sasha Pfeiffer, portrayed in the movie by Mark Ruffalo and Rachel McAdams. They talked about the new movie, the state of investigative journalism, and the real-life challenges they found themselves facing when they took on the Boston Archdiocese and uncovered a story that rocked the church and resonates today.
You know, we knew that we were up against a very powerful and beloved institution. And in many ways, this project was the ultimate reporting challenge because unlike nonprofits or companies where you can look up some sort of tax documents or many government agencies where you can send a Freedom of Information Act request and get public records, we couldn't do that with the church. It's protected by the First Amendment. And ultimately, our legal fight against the church said that we believe the public's right to know what's in those files is greater than the church's right to privacy. We ultimately won that fight, but it was a hard fight. So this was a formidable institution to go up against.
So much of this story is psychological and doesn't have clues and crime scenes that you can see. Did you see that psychological piece of it in the movie?
The psychological aspect with the victims presents a reporting problem in a way because typically a victim of child sex abuse will not come forward until they're an adult, sometimes not until decades after the abuse. So it makes it hard for someone like myself and Sasha to reconstruct the past. And it's also a problem in a legal sense because your right to sue runs out depending on what state you're living in, depending on the statute of limitations. What was different about our story is we proved that there was a cover-up. We proved that high-level church law knew what was going on and allowed it to go on.
But I think what we want to make sure people realize is that the psychological impact of this is massive and ongoing.